This is Bill Monroe inviting you to Meet the Press with consumer advocate Ralph Nader.
Meet the Press, the world's oldest network television program, is a public affairs presentation of NBC News.
Meet the Press is brought to you by Exxon. Energy for a strong America. To show how challenging it is to produce energy today, Exxon engineer Tom Matthews took a visitor on a tour of the world's tallest offshore platform when it was being built near San Francisco.
We're building it on its side. When it's upright, it will be about as tall as the Empire State Building.
5 months later, Tom Matthews was back to watch it go to sea.
Because it's so big, it's being towed one section at a time under the Oakland Bay and Golden Gate bridges, then out to an oil field off the California coast. When it's completed, it'll be the first platform to open up America's deep waters as a source of energy.
This platform is a good example of how Exxon is putting its capabilities to work. Its offshore experience, its technical know-how, and its financial strength to provide more energy for a strong America.
Our guest today on Meet the Press is consumer advocate Ralph Nader. Mr. Nader began his career as the nation's best-known spokesman for consumer interests 12 years ago, when at the age of 30 he took on General Motors and automobile safety. Since then, he has established a number of pro-consumer, legal, and lobbying organizations in Washington, including the membership organization called Public Citizen. Mr. Nader, during the election campaign, you spent one night with Jimmy Carter in Plains. You had high praise for him, and after the election, you wrote that Carter looks like good news for consumers. Now, based on what we have heard in recent days about his plans for energy, how do you now evaluate the president?
In some ways very good, in some ways still deficient. The energy conservation program, taking the approach of mandatory standards for appliance efficiencies and building efficiencies and automobile efficiencies, I think is very good. I think the attempt to try to get the utilities to price their electricity in a way to discourage waste, to develop cogeneration, which is a conservation effort, is also very good. But I don't think that the approach that some of the Carter energy package is taking regarding higher energy prices is the best way to go. First, in terms of the amount of conservation it will achieve, and second, in terms of the inflationary and other inequitable effects that it will produce. I think it's very weak, however, in the implementation of the energy conservation program. Above all, we need to have an energy conservation job corps, which will fan throughout the country under useful guidelines to retrofit America for energy efficiency, with all the great consequences of pollution reduction and job increase and inflation curtailment that such efficiencies entail.
Do you have any objection to President Carter's apparent plan to rely in a limited but nevertheless substantial amount on both nuclear energy and on coal, considering the problems with oil, etc.?
Yes, I do. I think that there's too much lip service to the great potential of energy conservation or efficiency, and not enough rational analysis as to what this would mean in terms of moving away from nuclear and reducing the expansion of coal production. I think it can be stated and shown in repeated studies as well as observation around the country that our economy can double in the next 35 years without increasing at all the energy consumption per capita. And I don't think we have to choose between nuclear or coal. The choices are energy conservation, prudent use of available oil and gas and existing coal resources, and the gradually accelerating conversion over the next 50 years of our economy to solar energy, which is the real answer.
Without expanding nuclear energy, without expanding coal production, you feel the economy of the country can grow?
Definitely. We waste, conventionally speaking, over half of our energy in this country. And in the longer range projection of technological efficiencies, we can probably increase our energy efficiency 3- to 4-fold. And in other words, we can save far more electricity and fuel, and far more electricity in particular than nuclear can give us, even if nuclear operates according to schedule, which it most definitely is not.
Thank you, Mr. Nader. Our reporters on Meet the Press today include Edward Cowan of the New York Times, George F. Will, syndicated columnist, and Irving R. Levine of NBC News. We'll be back with our questions in a minute.
Before they see Paris, thousands of tourists see us, United Technologies. Moving walkways from our Otis subsidiary at the Charles de Gaulle International Airport allow thousands of passengers an hour to ride from Plainside to the main terminal. Elsewhere, our Hamilton Standard Division has designed a computerized system to help institutions combat the high cost of energy. By helping monitor and conserve power use, it can cut fuel bills by substantial amounts. In Connecticut, our Sikorsky Aircraft Division has developed the U.S. Army's troop-carrying helicopter of the 1980s and 90s. It's the most technically advanced helicopter ever produced by Sikorsky for the U.S. military. Built to the rugged requirements for the Army of the future. We're the technologies of Sikorsky, Hamilton Standard, and Otis, 3 units of United Technologies. High technology is our basic strength. We make it work for you in many ways.
Now back to Meet the Press, an unrehearsed press conference. Here is Bill Monroe.
We'll continue the questions for Ralph Nader with Mr. Cowan.
Mr. Nader, when the Carter administration came in office, it brought with it a lot of people, young people, who were sympathetic generally to your point of view, environmentalists, some of them out of public interest research groups. One of your own close associates has an important job in the Highway Administration now. She runs it, I believe, Joan Claybrook. Gives rise to this question in my mind. What is your relationship to the White House? What sort of access do you have to the White House staff, to the President? How do you use it? How often? What kind of responses do you get? Do you feel that your ideas are being listened to attentively and responsively?
I think the White House is listening to other than business interests, which was characteristic of the Nixon and Ford administration. It's listening to consumer interests, environmental interests, in both organized and unorganized fashion. Our desire is to always convey our views to White House aides, to President Carter, and get some sense that they're at least reading our recommendations and acting on them one way or the other, rather than just shelving them. And thus far, they've been really quite responsive. Stu Eisenstadt and Ham Jordan and others.
Tell us in some detail. Can you call Stu Eisenstadt and get him on the phone almost any day you want to, or Jordan, or just how do you proceed? Tell us in some detail how you do that.
Well, I proceed largely in written form because I think that's a more comprehensive way to proceed. But on occasion, if a telephone call is necessary, I do get through. And President Carter has indicated that any time there is something important to convey directly to him, not to hesitate. Therefore, you tend to use it with some degree of economy because their time is valuable, and you feel that the White House is a White House of a broader range of public interest than hitherto has been the case.
Last August, when he was campaigning, Jimmy Carter said that he wanted to challenge Ralph Nader for the title of top consumer advocate in the country. Assuming you accept that title, do you feel that you're being challenged so far?
Well, it's a little too early to tell. I do know that he's taken the positions as president thus far that he has promised to take as candidate. He has come out for the consumer advocacy bill in Congress. He's come out for consumer class actions in federal courts. He's come out for expanded the right of citizens to sue government for corrupt or waste or inefficiency. And he's come out for reimbursing people around the country who cannot afford to participate in government regulatory proceedings here in Washington, but certainly have every right to do so if the economic barriers are lowered. Those are four important stands that he's recommended to Congress. We now await his position on the 5th important foundation of the consumer program this year, which is the passage of a consumer cooperative bank designed to extend credit and technical assistance to consumer co-ops around the country.
Mr. Will?
Mr. Nader, Mr. Carter's first task is to convince the country there's an energy crisis, and in your answer to Mr. Monroe's first question, you seem to say that we had enough energy, we just had lousy habits. Is that your position? Is there an energy crisis?
There is not an energy supply crisis. There is an energy monopoly crisis. Too many of the energy decisions being made by a few large corporations instead of by a broader aggregate of consumer determinants. There is an energy waste crisis. We are the most wasteful country in the world. In fact, people come from all over the world to watch us and see how we waste. We are also in a crisis of choosing the best form of energy to put our programs as a nation into. For example, solar energy has come a long way in the last 3 or 4 years. It is a highly practical way that we can start using in our economic system. But it is not the form of energy that immediately results in profits to the energy monopolies that now want to sell us more coal and oil and gas and synthetic fuels at higher and higher prices. Those are the kinds of crises we are in. We are not in an energy supply crisis per se.
Well, you emphasize waste, yet a number of consumer groups, some of them associated with you, have worked very hard and effectively to keep prices low, lower than the government in some cases wanted them, lower certainly than the market would have made them. Doesn't that encourage waste?
Not really when you have better alternatives. For example, the price of oil and gas has substantially gone up in the last 3 years, so that you can't say it's excessively cheap. Gasoline has doubled. Fuel oil in some places have tripled. Electric utility rates have doubled or tripled. If you have a better alternative than higher prices to the ultimate consumer, who are already burdened, you should take that alternative. And that alternative is to try to get energy efficiency by physically mandated standards for building efficiencies, new and used, for appliances, for furnaces, for automobiles, for industrial processes. There are just dozens of studies, dozens of statements by corporate executives, dozens of observations that we can make around the country illustrating how much waste there is in this country that can be reduced by better engineering and better processing of the equipment that consumes the energy.
The energy program, as it's emerging, seems to pose a conflict between two of your oldest causes, one of which is energy conservation and the other is auto safety, because there does seem to be some relationship between size and safety. And the only car built in America today that can meet the 1985 efficiency standards of 27.5 miles to the gallon is a very small automobile. Are you bothered by the fact that there's going to be some trade-off in terms of safety in order to achieve efficiency?
I'm bothered by the fact that some people in the administration, and of course the auto industry, want us to believe that there must be a trade-off. The important crash protection feature of a car is its size more than its weight. And cars can be made lighter, but still without a drastic increase of the size to protect the occupants in a crash and absorb the energy. Secondly, cars can remain the size they are and still have lower horsepower and more efficient engines. And that, of course, will improve gasoline efficiencies. And the administration, I think, is getting itself boxed in by a gasoline tax and a high horsepower tax or a gas guzzler tax without taking into account that if it doesn't also hold firm and advance the auto safety frontiers and deal with the problem of imports, it may result in bad economic and safety consequences. So there has to be a program going on all three of those fronts if we're going to achieve our goals. Clearly, the average automobile fuel efficiency in this country could double over the next 8 years, because we know that back 30 and 40 years, that cars, four-door cars, have been able to come up with 30 or 35% fuel efficiencies.
Mr. Levine?
Mr. Nader, in stating that you do not believe that there is an energy crisis, but no supply crisis, are you subscribing to the view of those who say that the problem is simply a conspiracy between the big oil companies and the Arab oil producers to get higher prices for their products?
Well, let's call it mutual self-interest. The oil-producing countries all over the world and the large oil corporations such as Exxon and Texaco have a mutual interest in high prices. And the Texaco and Exxon private cartels, so to speak, have been making more money when the OPEC price went up, not only because they sell it at a better absolute profit around the world, but because their reserves in this country, including Alaska, have increased enormously in value as a result. So it doesn't really have to be a conspiracy, it's just mutual self-interest. And as long as these parallel cartels tend to limit the flexibility of Washington or control Washington, particularly in terms of the oil industry, we are going to get an oil company-dominated energy policy, not a consumer-shaped energy policy. And as the oil companies are moving into coal, geothermal, and heavy into nuclear and uranium, you can see that all forms of energy will not become competitive with one another, but they will be pushed up to the highest price of oil, which at the present time is imported oil. And I think that's a prescription for economic, political, and technological disaster, unless it is broken, and the only group that can break it is the president and his advisors.
You've indicated that you see the solution in greater conservation, and you've spoken of the creation of an energy conservation corps. How will that operate? Will that be an army of people going around, going to people's homes to see how their thermostats are set and so on?
It would basically be a jobs program, decentralized throughout our cities and towns around the United States, working on energy waste audits, going from government buildings to industrial buildings to commercial buildings to residences. And together with the incentives and tax credits and other policies of the new administration, developing a continual process of energy efficiency. The beauty about the approach is that it solves a big gap in the Carter program, which is how do you implement energy conservation? Mr. Schlesinger has never been excessively sensitive to the citizen role in energy policy, whether in terms of his proposal to Congress for the reorganization of the energy agencies or in terms of his message, as far as we can determine from the early report that was made public last week, how are citizens going to implement it? Why not combine energy conservation and a jobs program? The controller of Houston, Leonel Castillo, sent energy auditors around to various city buildings in order to make this kind of inventory. That's the only way it's really going to be done.
Doesn't this make for a huge bureaucracy, huge expense?
It makes, first of all, for putting people to work with a double opportunity. One, to do constructive work and get paid for it, and second, to help solve the energy problem. And it's in many ways much more productive and cheaper than unemployment compensation and all the horrors of economic horrors and personal horrors of 8 or 9% unemployment. And secondly, it can be done efficiently. These are targeted schedules of reduced consumption of energy. There's a great opportunity for success because we waste so much. Just look at the World Trade Building in New York, for example. And thirdly, we can develop regional competition between states and cities and regions, something that's very important in this country to advance as a motivating force for a widespread national commitment to deal with this situation.
Are you talking, in effect, Mr. Nader, about scores of thousands of government inspectors who will be going into homes and offices and factories enforcing compliance with conservation standards?
No, that's bad imagery, and it's not really accurate. What we're talking about, first of all, is the retrofitting of buildings and other energy-consuming guzzlers in America. That means a lot of construction work, plumbers, insulation appliers, a lot of production in this area, so that there will be people working to retrofit these buildings in accordance with certain incentives that the Carter administration is putting forward. Now, there will be auditors. There should be auditors of city halls around the country, for example. There should be an inventory. It should sort of be like a scorecard. And it doesn't have to be anything that affects lifestyle except to reduce the bills and reduce the economic and pollution burdens of excessive energy consumption.
But you're talking about inspectors who would require compliance with government standards in homes and offices, et cetera.
That will require, of course, congressional legislation. For new buildings, there must be mandatory efficiency standards, and I think the Carter administration is moving in that direction. For old buildings, there are tax incentives and credits, et cetera. The question is, should be mandatory standards for older buildings. And certainly we can have them for federal, state, and locally owned buildings. We can have them for industries, and we can have them for these office buildings that waste so much energy and being overlit, overventilated, and overheated. I think we must remember, when we talk about conservation, it is not sacrifice. It's a liberation to a cleaner environment, more jobs, fighting inflation, and all the rest. And we should also remember that 60% of our energy goes through industry, commerce, and government. And that's where the big waste is. And the resulting 40% by consumers rely on the kind of equipment, such as automobiles or poorly built houses, that make them waste even if they want to be more thrifty. I don't want to discount the element of endpoint consumer or personal thrift and turning off lights where they're not needed. But I think we must realize that the major pivots of energy waste in this country are relatively small numbers of large buildings, factories, producers of automobiles, and construction firms, rather than saying that it's all going to have to change the habits of 200 million Americans.
Mr. Cowan?
Well, it seems to me you've said two different things about this, this Energy Conservation Job Corps. At one point you said it would perform energy waste audits. At another point you seem to say that it would employ electricians and carpenters and so forth who would actually do the retrofitting, which would imply, I think, that the federal government would be paying directly for the retrofitting. Now, which did you mean?
Well, obviously the federal government is going to pay whenever it gives an investment tax credit. It's paying indirectly.
A fraction.
We perhaps can go further. Suppose we look at it this way. This country spent $75 billion to send a number of men to the moon. And it had some beneficial side effects as well beyond that transit mission. Should we spend billions of dollars to retrofit America in terms of energy efficiency and to convert the country more rapidly into solar energy? Well, if you can justify the moon expenditure from an economic rationale, you can far more justify this kind of expenditure. That is, if, in answer to your question, there should be a greater federal assist pattern.
Well, what I'm trying to understand is whether you're saying the federal government should pay 100% of the cost of retrofitting, and if not, how do you expect to get people and businesses to make the capital outlays that energy conservation requires? It requires spending money.
Yes.
And how do you expect them to do that more than they've done it if energy prices don't go higher, giving them the opportunity to save money by retrofitting?
Because at the present time, it's cheaper for them to invest in energy conservation to save a barrel of oil than to buy a barrel of oil. There's adequate energy economic incentive to go conservation and investment compared to buying $2 per 1,000 cubic foot of gas, for instance. I don't think the government should pay the entire bill, of course. It's already sharing at 30–40% or thereabouts. But I do think that we should look very carefully at how much more efficient it is to move by way of conservation in all ways, including cogeneration, for example, which is a great way to promote electricity efficiencies. We should look at that and say, isn't it cheaper in all ways, including pollution control, to go this way than to go nuclear or than to go synthetic fuels or offshore drilling? That's the failure of the Schlesinger plan, that they say, well, conservation is important and nuclear and synthetics and oil and gas and coal, but they don't put them on a collision course with one another to force the superior economic alternative to get a superior priority in what they recommend and implement.
We have about 2.5 minutes. Mr. Will?
Mr. Nader, leaving energy aside for a moment, can you tell us what future decisions that you anticipate by the Carter administration concerning what issues? Will they demonstrate their virtue or lack thereof?
Well, I think, first of all, whether they are going to treat the problem of corporate power and corporate concentration in our economy, whether they are going to really become serious in moving under the anti-monopoly laws and perhaps new legislation as recommended by Attorney General Bell last week to deconcentrate the economy, make it more competitive, make a new philosophy behind job intensiveness instead of capital intensiveness, and in a sense promote economic democracy.
You're, I think, more ferocious in denouncing than precise in defining monopoly. And some people argue that you neglect the fact that when a firm achieves a large share of a market, that is often because people prefer its product. And Nader wants, they say, to overturn the verdict of the market. And they ask, in whose name does Nader speak? Who do you speak for besides Nader?
Speak for myself. That's the essential right of a citizen.
Mr. Levine?
Mr. Nader, the British-French supersonic Concorde has been operating in and out of the United States for several months now. How has this experience affected your attitude toward that plane?
Well, I think it's an atrocious economic venture. I think the small taxpayers in England and France are paying the bill for millionaires and government officials from those countries to travel on the SST. And on this side of the continent, the people who live around New York or Washington or elsewhere are suffering from the sonic abuses and perhaps, if there are more SSTs, more serious environmental abuses. It can't be justified from either an economic or environmental point of view.
If the Consumer Protection Agency is passed, what's the first job you'd like to see it undertake?
I think the major job is to represent consumers in the energy policy right across the board, from nuclear to solar to energy conservation to pricing.
Thank you, Mr. Nader, for being with us today on Meet the Press. I'll be back in a minute with a look at letters.
Energy for a strong America.
Our country may be running short of oil and natural gas, but we're lucky to have 4 other forms of energy we can develop. First, there's coal. We've got plenty of it, and by 1990, it could supply 25% of our energy needs. Second, there's nuclear energy. It can provide an important part of our electricity needs. Third, there's solar energy. It's got a bright future, and a lot of bright people have to keep working to find ways to make it more economical. And fourth, there's you and all the rest of us. We're a form of energy, too. The more energy we can all save, the less America has to depend on foreign sources to meet our needs. Our conservation efforts and energy development from coal, nuclear, and solar power will help provide energy for a strong America.
Commenting on last week's program, Leo Schwamberger writes from Ohio, Senator Long, in his defense of the waterways projects, proved the fallacy of allowing men to remain in office too long. They use millions and billions so glibly without thought of the little guy back home who has to foot such bills. And Dinag Mehta writes from Minnesota, Senator Long's lukewarm support of public financing of congressional campaigns was very disappointing. We must get the for sale sign off our congressman. The special address to write to, if you would like to comment on this program, is Meet the Press, NBC, Washington, D.C., 20016.
For a printed transcript of Meet the Press, write to Merkel Press, Box 2111, Washington, D.C. 20013. That's Merkel Press, Box 2111, Washington, D.C. 20013. Enclosed 25 cents and a stamp, self-addressed envelope.
Next Sunday on Meet the Press, our guest will be another headline figure in the news. Now this is Bill Monroe saying goodbye for Ralph Nader and Meet the Press.
Meet the Press has been brought to you by Exxon.
Tonight on Lanigan's Rabbi, Art Carney is police chief. Lanigan becomes a homicide suspect. Then McLeod meets Dracula when a sniper turns out to be a vampire. Lanigan's Rabbi, McLeod, an NBC double-feature mystery movie, tonight starting at 8, 7 Central Time. This is Lee Dayton speaking.